So Dorothy Day said, "Peace begins when the hungry are fed." And today we have a buddy of mine who is a professor by background, I believe, if I remember correctly, and is also a one on the Enneagram, is a moral theologian, a Catholic worker, a longtime war tax resistor, also the national coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, and is also a brilliant author. He has just recently wrote a book on one of the co-initiators of the Catholic Worker Movement, the radical Peter Morin, who, along with Dorothy Day, helped to really shape American Catholicism in the early 20th century, along with a leading number of other folks who were influenced by their witness to gospel nonviolence and radical solidarity with the poor. So Lincoln, can you give us a little bit of a rundown on Peter Morin, why you wrote the book, and how you think it could advance our movement?
Sure, thank you. It is wonderful to be here and talk to you, Jerry. So Peter Morin, one of the co-founders of the Catholic Worker Movement. And so the Catholic Worker Movement started during the Great Depression in the United States and is probably most well known for its houses of hospitality. We don't know for sure, but probably around 175 separate entities that are Catholic worker houses of hospitality around the United States that, depending on what those people's gifts are and what they see the need as, might have a soup kitchen, might provide short-term housing for families or long-term housing for single people, all over the board. Kind of the other aspect that the Catholic worker is known for is its pacifist stance and really helping to legitimize pacifism as a legitimate stance during World War II and afterwards in American Catholicism. And so Peter Morin, Dorothy Day is probably the more well-known face. She also lived a lot longer. She was a lot younger than Peter. And so she lived until 1980. Peter died more early on in the movement. He passed away in 1949, but I have a picture of him here. It's on the cover of this wonderful book that has come out, an complete edition of all of his writings. So the forgotten radical Peter Morin. So we see him in what he was often known doing, which was making a point. Here you can see him making a point literally, probably in some church basement. We don't know exactly where the photo was taken, but it looks like some religious art on a wall painted behind him. And but he grew up as a French peasant in a large family in rural southern France. For a while, contemplated a call to an order with a order of brothers in France, a teaching order. And so he took temporary vows with them before deciding that that was not the life he wanted to lead. Got involved in some social movements in France in the first decade of the 20th century, and then chose to emigrate to Canada. He rarely talked about himself. So finding out information about Peter, especially before the Catholic Worker in 1933, is difficult to come by. But it seems like he left because military service was mandatory, even when he was a brother, because of the mood the mood of secularism in France at that time. Priests and brothers were not exempt from military service. And so as a brother, he had to serve multiple times. Then after he left, he was still serving. And then it appeared he was moving around France a lot before he left for Canada in an attempt to avoid military service. And that appears to be maybe the reason he left. He just disliked it so much. Then he got a piece of land with a friend. His friend died in an accident. We don't exactly know all the details. He never shared them. And then traveled around the United States and said, in some manner of speaking, he had left his Catholicism. We're not sure how. Then had come back to it, but really invigorated with synthesis of a social theory that he felt was the answer for the problems of the United States. And he'd even started giving talks about this even before the Great Depression. He seemed to think, in one sense, I think he knew it was coming. And but it wasn't until 1933 that he ran into Dorothy Day and said, I think the Catholic Church, or at least his interpretation of how he viewed the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith, had a template for how to create what he termed a functional society where people would get together, have discussions to work out problems. There would be houses of hospitality, which would allow people, which would make sure that we don't have homeless, but also, especially, I mean, I think we see it greater today than we did during the 1930s, where just this, not only racial segregation, but economic segregation, and that houses of hospitality would allow people of different classes and races to have a meeting place. But hopefully that's not one of just one group helping out the other, but leading to empathy and working together to create a better society, which was the last portion of his plan, which is probably the least known and the least tested, though there are folks who try, which is he was essentially his long-term goal or plan for society was going back to a village type economy, moving away from industrialism and limits on wealth, and that this sort of society with smaller communities would be ones in which we could truly treat each other as fellow children of God and create a civilization of love.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really, from what from even what you've just said, I mean, I think it's important to point out that there was obviously a lot of influences on him at the time when he was alive, because there was a lot of things happening in the world at the intersections of faith and justice. When he was a brother in France at that time, the Catholic, not Catholic, the worker priest movement was getting really started. It originally started in Belgium, but or rather it started in France and then really took off in Belgium later on a few years, and then died out in Europe altogether and went over to Latin America and is still very prominent in Latin America. But the model of, because priests and brothers were not exempt from the military and from social services like that, or social requirements like that, a lot of priests decided, well, if we're going to have to be amongst the people in this regard, why don't we do away with all of this institution together and live and work amongst the people during the week, and on the weekends do our priestly ministry. And so I have no doubt that Peter Morin was influenced by that model and really took that into the United States, into Canada, North America. And also at that same time, there were, other ecclesial leaders and other movements happening, and other social thought leaders. So there was a lot of influence on him, and I do think that he was in a flow of like prophetic knowing that probably really gave him some deep insight into not only what is possible when people get together, but also what was going to happen. When he was in North America, he really saw the rise of the industrial movement, and also all of the negative realities of commodifying life. And then when he hooked up with Dorothy Day, who was a prominent social activist on her own, and writer, and just outspoken human being, it was like it was quite literally a match made in heaven, because they brought their skills together and helped to initiate this wave of consciousness that I think ultimately led to the initiation of the Second Vatican Council, the rise of different social theories and faith-based community organizing, and a whole bunch of different stuff that I think we now take for granted, and we don't really realize how deeply revolutionary this was because it was so opposed to what was being promoted at the time. But also how deeply, I don't want to say orthodox, but how deeply like very much like black and white it was because it came straight out of the gospel. So it wasn't like they were inventing a whole new like religion or something like that. They're like holding the church accountable to what's in the book. um, yeah, so tell us a little bit more about the book and some of Peter's writings and all that.
Yeah, so, and yeah, I think you're right. Peter, we don't know exactly what movements he was all influenced by. We know he was influenced by, one movement called La Salon, which that's my bad French, but which was a lay Catholic movement. But he was part of it, and we've learned about that. But other probable influences that you mentioned, because he never talked about himself, we just don't know. But yeah, just to kind of show, because this book is nearly 600 pages. But while that might seem intimidating at first, Peter wrote, like at first it looks like they're poems. This isn't like reading War and Peace. And so Peter, and he got this method from when he was a brother. The brothers like to teach through a certain cadence and through some repetition. And actually, before he moved more into his radical self in the late 20s and early 30s, he made a living by teaching French, because that was during the 20s that had come into vogue, and it paid a lot better than all the other jobs that he did that were very hard manual labor. And but from what we understand, he also taught French in this way, kind of in short little bursts with some repetition to help people ingrain it in their memory. So this book brings together all of his, we call them easy essays. Each easy essay, most of them look like a poem that take up normally the size of a page. Some are longer, some are shorter. In this book, we have all 482 of those essays that he published in the New York Catholic Worker during his lifetime. There are some previous collections that people have put out, but none of them have ever put all of his previously published essays in them. And then this one also includes 87 unpublished essays, ones that really never saw the light of day. They've been maybe a handful of them have been published in some Peter Morin biographies in the late 50s and 1980, but otherwise they haven't received much circulation. The other thing with the book is Peter's a great historian, and he's always mentioning a lot about Catholic history, European history, more particularly normally, early church history, but also the contemporary time during the Great Depression. And so he'll be mentioning lots of figures that people might not know. So on the back, there's what's known as, I've called it a biographical glossary. And so maybe there's around 300 entries. So every person he mentions, if someone doesn't know who they are and they want more information, there's a little paragraph in the back that says, who is this person? Why is Peter mentioning them? And is he using them correctly? Sometimes he'll quote someone, and sometimes he's quoting them correctly, and sometimes he might be taking them out of context, which was, I think today we'd view that poorly. During the 1930s, that was part of rhetoric at the time, that if you wanted to prove your case, you might quote a well-known person, though you might sometimes take them out of context. But maybe just to give a flavor, there's one here that I chose one that's purposefully less historical, so I'm not throwing around names, but I think you get a flavor of how Peter wrote and how he talked. Because when he'd give talks and get invited to churches, he would just recite his easy essays. So this is what you'd hear him talk about. This essay is called Barbarians and Civilized. We call barbarians people living on the other side of the border. we call civilized people living on this side of the border. We civilized living on this side of the border are not ashamed to arm ourselves to the teeth so as to protect ourselves against the barbarians living on the other side. And when the barbarians, born on the other side of the border, invade us, we do not hesitate to kill them before we have tried to civilize them. So we civilized exterminate barbarians without civilizing them, and we persist in calling ourselves civilized. So I do think there's, with his comments on borders that separate us, with his comments on economics, as he's writing during the Great Depression when we're seeing capitalism at its worst. And as we're still living in post the Great Recession and maybe a small recession now that supposedly we're facing some recovery, but still we know how many people are left behind and how many people have two jobs, and those two jobs aren't enough to sustain them. And so his writings are, I think, still pertinent and still have a way about them to break open truths that we know on a deeper level, but don't always think about.
It hits me how well, I guess it's not really that long ago that he wrote that. And yet it seems so fresh, as if he was still alive today, like commenting on our foreign policy in the United States, and how we treat people, on the Texas-Mexico border, or the people who are coming, to the United States to escape terrorism, terrorism that we fund, every day. And so it shows how much of a prophet, he was, whether he knew it or not. To him, he might have just felt like he was just, I don't know, just like writing about what was on his mind. But really, I mean, it was like inspired word. And something that's interesting about Peter and Dorothy too is that they both really came into their full consciousness in the midst of crisis. Dorothy, when she lived in San Francisco, was there during the great earthquake that basically destroyed all of the Bay Area, primarily San Francisco. And she witnessed there people getting together and organizing themselves and doing, sharing food and creating medical areas. And like, she witnessed what was possible when people chose to not just survive, but to thrive with each other. And I think that planted a seed into her mind. And the same with Peter, and going through, what was happening at that time in Europe and ultimately into North America, being a peasant, being somebody who was at the very bottom of the ring, and seeing that, what Matthew Fox writes a lot about, that, when we enter into the via negativa, the dark night of the soul, it's not really an absence of, it's really more an opportunity for the next path, the creativa, the path of the creativity. That out of crisis, creativity is always birthed, whether we realize it or not. It's more like an incubator. And I really think that if we look at the history of the Catholic Worker Movement through Peter and Dorothy's eyes, and through the the lives of other people, we really see how the movement has helped to move us along as a church, but also as a society, because they were able to commit to that crisis, and in that crisis give birth to a new creative way of dealing with it. And how they did that was by addressing the needs, right? Dorothy lived and Peter lived in New York during the Great Depression, where everybody was hungry. So what did they do? They started a food line. You know, they started feeding people. And as more people started hearing about it, they were like, well, people need to know why we're doing this. So they created a newspaper. And then, you know, somebody knocked on Dorothy's house and said, hey, I need a place to stay. And then she's like, well, people need housing. So they started Houses of Hospitality. You know, it was always something that was based upon need. In the 80s, during the height of the HIV/AIDS plague, a lot of Catholic workers saw the need for poor Black and brown folks who didn't have access to quality health care, maybe because they were sex workers or maybe because they were people who were dealing with addictions. They saw that need, and out of compassion and the vision of justice that's proclaimed in the gospel, they went forth, and some of them went and you know, did things that they could to get medicines for people or to find places for them to die with dignity. Our friend Michael Horank started Bethany House in Oakland, California, which was a house for people to be able to live out the rest of their lives as people with HIV, and to provide them some dignity. That was a need, you know. And so anyway, I just think that that is something that we need to hold on to as we continue through this pandemic, because Peter in his writings and Dorothy as well in her writings and in her public speaking engagements really motivated people to don't shy away from what's happening. You know, put your feet solid and flat on the ground and commit to learning how to thrive together, not on your own, not in this idea of like, you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. It's that the kingdom of God happens when we link arms and we work together. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well,
or maybe your own experience of that.
Sure. I mean, when you were talking, it reminded me of something. So maybe I'll just take it just a slightly different direction, but I think still related.
Sure.
So there's another easy essay that I'd like to share, but then kind of lead into a larger conversation of today and what we're talking about. And so this essay is called Social Workers and Workers. The training of social workers enables them to help people to adjust themselves to the existing environment. The training of social workers does not enable them to help people to change the environment. Social workers must become social-minded before they can be critics of the existing environment and free creative agents of the new environment. In Houses of Hospitality, social workers can acquire that art of human contacts and that social mindedness or understanding of social forces, which will make them critical of the existing environment and free creative agents of a new environment. And, you know, one of the most publicized and, you know, one of the big topics that's making headlines, you know, this year with COVID-19 is the issue of police conduct and police misconduct, and just the issue of policing and the need to think differently about how we want to live in our cities. And, you know, some of the calls for defund the police are putting more of this focus on, well, you know, if there's a crisis call, perhaps we should be sending social workers. And, you know, when I hear that, I'm reminded of Peter Morin's essay right here. Are we sending social workers who are just going to try to put people in another box or say, you need to take this class or you need to do this? You're not going to go to jail, but instead of going to jail, you might need to adjust your hours at work or miss hours at work because now we set up this class that's government funded and et cetera, and it's going to totally disrupt your lives and disrupt your parenting and disrupt this and that. We'll make some money on our government contract, But again, it's part of this focus that there's something wrong with you, and we're here as either, sometimes the police or sometimes social workers, to try to fix this problem. And I think that's where Peter Morin's commentary here on needing social workers who are more social minded, who are more agents of creative change. And I think that's what we're ideally trying to do in the Catholic Worker Movement, which is why he mentions that social workers should visit Catholic worker houses of hospitality and get a greater sense of what's really wrong. It's not the people that are falling through the cracks or are having trouble with the system. The system is the problem, and we need to be working more to change that system. And, so Catholic worker houses, in addition to doing hospitality, almost always have some other justice issue they're working on. Traditionally it has maybe been some anti-war activity, but it's also usually included if that Catholic worker community sees a lot of the people that they're in contact with being unfairly taken to jail, they usually get involved also in some sort of jail ministry, or trying to maybe, even though for the most part we try to be more of an anarchist group, it might mean trying to meet with some of the city council members and saying, we need to change this policy. Why are we putting these people in jail? It doesn't make any sense. And so trying, as Peter Morin would say, borrowing it from the industrial workers of the world, the phrase, we need to create a new society in the shell of the old. So that's, I think, the ideal work of the Catholic Worker Movement, and he's hoping to inspire that thought in other professions and in other people's lives.
Yeah, it's a commitment to the dream of God, of the beloved community. What Henry, and it's really, I think, a reinforcement or maybe a wholehearted commitment to the idea that all of us are born in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we have an inherent dignity. What we call personalism in the Catholic worker. That each one of us have a personal responsibility to honor and care for the particular manifestation of the divine in front of us. And that includes addressing the social system that seeks to demonize and oppress, abuse, and murder the incarnation of God that is in our world. And historically, the worker movement has done that through, the works of mercy, the physical, or the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, which help to lessen the amount of burden that the poor have to carry each day, but also through, like what you talked about, radical anarchist inspired radical action, revolutionary faith that motivated a lot of people to go forth and hammer on nuclear weapons, spend time in prison for a long time. Who are those people? The two young Catholic worker women who were a part of the what do they call those things? You know who I'm talking about. They're in your area.
Yeah, the valve turners.
Yes, the valve turners. Yes.
One of them is Brenna. I know Brenna the best.
Yeah.
There's Michelle, who's up at Duluth, but yeah, Brenna, who's with St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm in southwestern Wisconsin, and then two other wonderful folks that I don't know as well.
Yeah, but they were inspired by the same vision, of turning swords into plowshares and recognizing that, this is not the dream, this is not what we're called to be. And we need to disrupt and disobey and refuse and non-cooperate and there are other more colorful words I would like to use, but but basically like screw up the system so that we can have more room to do what we need to do. This is not our best, and we need to strive for what is for the best for all of us. I'm a part of a group, an anarchist group. It's a international movement, Food Not Bombs, and here in Houston, our chapter actually is one of the most active ones in the US, because we meet 4 times a week to give out free food, as well as like sometimes we get clothes, sometimes we get medicine, sometimes we have one woman who likes to come and do nails for people. She paints people's nails and does like pedicures and stuff like that, or manicures, whatever they're called. And then we have another person who comes like once a month and does haircuts for folks. And really anybody that can come who's hungry, that and get food from us. But it's usually people who are homeless, who are in between jobs, and who just can't afford to have that they don't have enough money that week for food. And so they come to us, and we very freely give it. We never ask for anything, and we also hang out with them. Like we don't just come, provide this service, and then leave. Uh, we strive to stay there, to hang out with them, to get to know them, to be friends with them, or sometimes just to be friendly with them, because sometimes they don't want to be friends with us, and that's totally fine. I don't know where people get this idea that homeless people need to always be grateful. Like, it's like they're human beings. They get grumpy. They have, bad days, and they have good days, and they don't have to say thank you. They don't have to be grateful. So anyway, but I volunteer with that group, and one of the things that we say all the time in that group when people ask us why we do what we do is we say we are there because we believe in solidarity, not charity. Because charity is just me giving you something and then going on with my life and not caring anything about you. The solidarity says, no, what's happening to you could happen to me, and it could happen to other people around me. And so why don't we help together to reimagine how we want to be in the world? And Peter and Dorothy both helped to provide some formation in that regard.
I forget what metaphor you're using for this powerful message. But I know the one that always comes to my mind is because it's the one that Peter used in one of his early essays. He referred to it as needing to blow the dynamite.
Oh, I love that.
So for a pacifist group, though, I think he felt that there's this message in Christianity that is so radical, but so many people, theologians, bishops, and regular Catholics and other Christians, will try to keep it canned. He uses this imagery of a hermetically sealed can, because canning was very popular at the time for canning your tomatoes and apples and pears and peaches. And he's like, you're treating this message like you need to can it for either because you're afraid of it, or maybe it's for next year or something. I don't know. But he's like, not only do you need to rip the can off, or rip the lid off that can, you need to blow the dynamite of this message out, because it's a powerful message to create a new world. So.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's like our churches oftentimes will have like these really nice pews with like this pretty fabric on it, and they're super comfy, and then and they're all really nice and clean and everything, and then a homeless person comes in, and they invite them in because they want to be all nice and everything, and then they sit down, and after the service is over, they realize the chair has been stained. And they get all upset about it, and then from that point on, they don't let homeless folks in. Well, what's interesting about that is I think the church is preaching before they actually ever do, because it shows where their priorities are. It shows that they want to look good instead of doing good, right? So yeah, so I'm just absolutely, I just love Peter and Dorothy. I just think they are true modern examples of what it means to be a disciple of the nonviolent Christ. The Christ who challenged the system of, Jesus would not have been killed if he was a good, law-abiding individual. This whole narrative that people say, like, well, if such and such person was following the law, they would not have gone to jail. Well, Breonna Taylor was following the law, and she got murdered in her own home. Like, so that's a silly concept. Jesus, you know, got killed for the idea of caring for other people, for being compassionate, and challenging those church and society that that did not support that idea. So anyway, well, I don't want to preach anymore. So why do you feel like? Well, I feel like you maybe have already answered this question, but maybe you can go into a little bit more specific detail. Why did you feel the need to write this book, and why did you write it in the format that you wrote it?
Yeah, I must admit, when I first came to the Catholic Worker in 1998, maybe about 5 or 6 years earlier in high school, I'd read Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness. And I mean, her book, her autobiography had just blown me away. And I felt like it was a faith that I was already into, but it made it so much more relevant for my life and so much more relevant for my interactions in the world, showing me kind of a template for how, what Christianity could mean today and the seeds that are there for creating a new society. Peter, at first I viewed him as eccentric. And there was his farming and small village notion, which at first I'm just like, I don't know about that. But I think the longer that I've seen the longer that I've lived in a city, and I do enjoy living in a city, but at the same time, I also see that cities are not self-sustaining entities, and so many of the families that we see, you know, are surviving on jobs like noodles, and you can't make a living wage at noodles, and you can't support your family there. And truthfully, there aren't even enough noodle jobs if everyone wanted a noodles job. there just aren't enough jobs, period, in a city. So Peter seemed to have this message for building a new society that I started getting into over the last 12, 15 years. And I would read some of the other editions of his essays that are out there, but when I'd go to the archives, so I guess I haven't mentioned this, like one other question could be, where did I find these unpublished essays, these 87 unpublished essays? And as just by luck, you know, I have been in Milwaukee. I grew up north of Milwaukee in Green Bay, Wisconsin, but otherwise, since I've been about 19 years old, I've been living in Milwaukee. And at Marquette University, the library there houses the Catholic Worker Archives. They started housing them, I believe, in the early 1960s. Dorothy always kind of liked Marquette, and my understanding is they were the first ones to ask, which always helps. So they happened to be here, and along with all of these other essays that Peter wrote that were never published. And, you know, so I'd be at the archives checking out something else perhaps, but I'd say, oh, and I'd be looking through old Catholic Worker newspapers, which aren't all digitized yet. So even the ones that are published, the papers from the 30s and 40s when he was writing them, they aren't all available online yet. You can only see them if you have access to the paper copies. And I'd be reading through the old papers and I'd be like, wow, I've never read this easy essay that Peter wrote before. It's so fascinating, and I haven't seen it in any other book. And then I happened to notice the unpublished ones, and some of them, there are a few of the unpublished ones where it literally like stops mid-essay, and I've included those. There aren't too many of those, like 2 or 3 where it stops mid-essay and he never figured out an ending, but it had an interesting beginning, so I put it in there. But there's also a set of them where they weren't meant for the paper. He wrote them for the farm. I believe it was the summer of 38. He was out on the farm helping that summer, and to give people some food for thought while they were weeding or milking or whatever they happened to be doing that day on the farm. On the billboard, before they'd head out for the day, he'd put one of these easy essays. And so it's specifically supposed to keep people thinking about building a new society grounded in their faith and culture and cultivating that literally and in their minds. So I just think there's a lot of previous content that wasn't widely available that I was partially is because I was so interested in it. And I thought, I'm just lucky enough to see it because I can go to the library, though I can't now because of COVID, they're closed. But other people would have to come to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to see it. So now they don't have to if they don't want to. It's all in one place so that they can read all of Peter and get the full breadth of his thought.
So what other resources that you utilize? Are there any other books on him?
Yeah, there's, because he passed away in 49, and then in 59, there are 3 biographies of Peter. There's the first one in 59 by Arthur Sheehan, who knew Peter. He was one of the founders of the Boston Catholic Worker House during the 30s, but then would travel around with Peter a lot and really respected Peter and would ask him as much as he could about his life. And so he really was instrumental in finding out at least a lot of the basic background information about Peter. It's still a great book to read. It's called Peter Morin, Gay Believer, 1959. And then 1980, I think there's a book put out by Mark Ellis, who Catholic worker who teaches in Jewish studies, Jewish social thought. I forget where, but he's still around in publishing. And he also, with his involvement with the worker, was very moved by Peter's thought and got in touch with his family and did some more research and really added some more. The other, I do in the introduction, I put a brief life of Peter, but because there are these 2 previous biographies that I feel are really lay the basic groundwork, I don't want to just repeat everything. But there is a 3rd one that's not published. It was done as a master's thesis by a person who at the time was a Catholic worker in Toronto by the name of Luke Stocking. He wrote his thesis on the Green Revolution, Peter Morin and the Green Revolution. And so if you look at the footnotes, you'll see I use him a lot because he also respected Peter, took his life seriously, and even did some further research. Living in Canada, he was hoping to find out where Peter actually settled in Canada for a while, where he homesteaded, but he was looking through records and maybe it was in his partner's name. He could never find where Peter lived in Canada, and Peter never shared it. But, and maybe just to talk about this, Peter always put the emphasis on the message. So he rarely talked about himself. And so there was a story, I need to ask Luke Stocking where he got this from, because when he was doing research here for his thesis, I remember he shared this story with me. I don't remember where he got it from, but essentially it's the 30s. There was someone who's kind of newer to the worker, had shown up there, and it was a common thing for Peter at night to go to one of the local squares in New York and sell the newspaper for a penny a copy. And after they were out selling it that night, this newer worker said, well, Peter, you want to go out for a beer? I'm buying. And Peter's like, sure. And so they go out and they have a beer and, have a decent time. And then they come home, and the next morning, or maybe it's lunch, because Peter often slept in till like 10 o'clock. He would stay out late. So probably over lunch, he and this newer worker and Dorothy Day are all sitting at the same table, and the newer worker says to Dorothy, Peter was sharing this really interesting story about his, I don't know what the fact was. I don't know if it's known, but some fact that Dorothy Day, who's working with him now for years and years, had never heard. And she looks at Peter rather disgruntled and says, Peter, why have you never told me this about you? And And Peter responded, well, Dorothy, you never bought me a beer. So supposedly that's a true story. And, but maybe it took a beer and a late night and Peter's getting a little tired to finally share something about himself, because he really always wanted to talk about the message. He really, I don't know if he'd use the word prophet for himself, but I think if he didn't use that word, that's how he envisioned himself, and always staying on point. But he is a character.
I love that. That's so funny. That totally sounds like a response that Dorothy would give, you know, and Peter. That's hilarious. Well, you know, I don't know your. I think we've actually talked about this. This next part, because I want to touch on this a little bit for two reasons. One, because it's LGBTQIA plus History Month today, starting today. And also two, I think it's important to recognize that there are queer folks who started a lot of prominent things in movements and organizations and ideas, and influenced our country and the world in a lot of significant ways. So there is a lot of speculation that Peter could have been a gay man. Now, there's no proof to it as far as we can tell. It's all inference. But he very much comes off to me as portraying a lot of the qualities of gay men of his time, in how he behaved, how he responded to certain people, how he tended to gravitate closer towards men than he did women. And a whole slew of other things. Where was I going to go with this? But you know, there's also, I think, a point to be made that maybe he wasn't necessarily gay, but maybe he was a lot more open-minded about those things, and maybe a little bit more freer with that type of way of showing love, because he did come out of the bohemian, you know, reality. And the bohemian culture was very much more open-ended when it came to sexuality, more what we would call fluid today. So have you, in your research, when you were writing this book, maybe you didn't, you know, focus on it or not, but have you or any other persons done a little bit of research on this particular topic and maybe drawn your own conclusions that you want to share?
Sure. I don't have a conclusion about if Peter was gay or not. I do think, you know, and it'd be interesting to study the history of when that notion first was introduced. I think, and I wonder if, you know, the fact that his first biography in 1959 by Arthur Sheehan is called Peter Morin, Gay Believer, you know, obviously when that book was published, Arthur Sheehan did not mean to imply that Peter Morin was gay. It was meant in a very different sense of how Peter was, you know, this wasn't a penitent, I always need to be punishing myself and full of qualms. And, you know, this is a person who had a very positive view of the faith and a positive view of how it could influence our individual lives and society. And, you know, but obviously as someone who, to the best of our knowledge, if he ever dated anyone, we have no idea. Like and at least even in his early life, because I don't remember what grade it was, but for sure by the time that someone would normally be entering high school, that's when he went to boarding school, in an all-boys boarding school for the order that he eventually took temporary vows for. You know, so even before he would hit this normal dating age, he was already in an all-male environment considering a celibate life. But the other thing that, you know, adds speculation is that when he settled in Canada, he settled with a partner. And of course, the language of, he called him a partner, and now the language of partner, you know, well, now I think people use it for all different kinds of partners, but, you know, he used that language of partner And oddly enough, they didn't speak the same language, at least not initially. But they met on the boat over to Canada, and they settled down together. And it was after this person was killed. It seemed, we're not positive, but it seems like maybe there was a hunting accident. But I know there are theories like if they were gay and living in this, you know, homesteading on this new, well, stolen piece of land. Wasn't like it was a new frontier land that no one had ever been there before. But anyways, Peter had settled on this piece of land, and if he was gay and that was discovered, it could have been that his partner was murdered. And that could have been the impetus for him leaving, is perhaps he would also be murdered. But again, he never talked about himself. If someone ever tracked down who his partner was or what the piece of property was, and then we could like track down a death certificate but all of, so, it definitely is, his life is situated in such a way that it's open-ended and we don't know. But there definitely are folks who, in my research and just in my talking with other Catholic workers, there definitely are Catholic workers that, looking at his life, feel almost absolutely certain that he was gay, but others who feel pretty certain that he wasn't, and it's just a bunch of coincidences. But so I don't know. Again, if he ever talked at all about himself, we might know something. But and maybe the other piece here is when he was talking to Dorothy early on, and I forget if this is in Dorothy's autobiography, The Long Loneliness, but at some point he mentions that during the late teens and early 20s, he was living a life that wasn't Catholic or wasn't Christian. And again, we don't know what that means. It could be that he's maybe when he was in Chicago and teaching French, and that was probably the wealthiest he ever was in his life, making some decent money. Maybe he took on a lover. Could have been a man, could have been a woman, but we don't know. Unfortunately, no one ever came forward to who shared that, either during his life or after he died or with anyone. I guess he was so, for better or for worse, he wasn't memorable enough with people that he was with in Chicago during this kind of unknown period of his life for anyone else to ever come forward and share stories about him.
Yeah, well, part of, I think, that consciousness around being raised a peasant is you develop this idea that a poverty of self-worth, you're not just poor in finances, you're poor in your perspective of yourself. So oftentimes you're like, well, people don't want to listen to me, or people don't want to love me. So that's a big part of the narrative for gay and lesbian men of that era. And he certainly was alive at the time of when many prominent, mostly gay men, but also women and trans folks and others were establishing organizations and things like that, and we're beginning, what we call now the LGBT movement, which everybody thinks started at Stonewall, but it really started far earlier than that, at least in this country. And so I do think there's a lot of historical markers that imply to, I think, a very good extent that he certainly could have come out of that community. And I do make the conclusion from my understanding of his life and things like that I do think he was a gay man. And so I wanted to bring that up because I think it's important to hold that piece into his narrative. Dorothy too, because she had she had a very interesting love life. You know, and it humanizes them for one thing. It shows that you can be prophetic, very saintly people, and also be a human being that's complex, that has passions, that has uh, what's the word? That has desires, that has issues, that has things that you grapple with. You know, you're not this a superhero that's completely untouchable. Um, and you know, Dorothy was very explicit in her writings about, you know, the things that she went through in her life, and um, her abortion, and writing about some of her interactions with other people, um, writing about a woman who she felt like she was attracted to at one point in her life. That influence, you know, those types of experiences and how that influenced her treating other people, and particularly in the worker movement, as well as the issue of racism. I think the issue of LGBT people in the movement has always been one that we've never addressed authentically and honestly. Um, uh, Dorothy was could be very mean at times to people, including to gay and lesbian people who were a part of the worker. Um, and so, you know, there's blind spots anyway. So that was why I was bringing it up, because I wanted to help humanize, you know, this reality that you know, there are different levels of complexity to these really wonderful people, and we shouldn't deny those parts of their humanity.
Yeah, and yeah, especially I do think it's worth talking about, even though I don't know if we can know, but it's and I think it does humanize both of them. Yeah, with Dorothy, we obviously know a little bit more because you know, she shares an experience of attraction that she had at one point, um, and doesn't condemn herself for having those feelings. Um, with Peter, we do, I don't know. When it comes to, you know, sexual mores and what their thoughts were on that, then it gets very complex because both of them were staunchly against birth control. And Dorothy probably wrote maybe just slightly more about it. She never made it a big topic. um, and Peter also, that is probably one of for if someone's reading through these essays and reading all social thought, and then I forget if it's around 1940 41, all of a sudden, if you're reading through these essays, you come to a short block of them where Peter's justifying the church's position on birth control, against birth control use. And it really seems out of nowhere based on you'll have read 7 years now of all this social thought, and then he rarely touches on issues of sexuality. And now he's talking about birth control. And I did put a footnote in there because at this time he had recently opened a new center. He was always trying out new experiments, and he had opened a new center to try to evangelize and reach out and show people that the Catholic faith had something worthwhile. And so I think one of the reasons he was publishing these essays and wrote these essays on birth control, I mean, one, I think he believed it, but also I have a feeling that as he reached out to folks and tried to say, have you considered Catholicism? He must have been hearing, I don't know about birth control though. The Catholic Church seems a little outdated there. And so he's writing about it. But then on the flip side of that, both Dorothy and Peter, both before, with Dorothy before she was Catholic and after her conversion, and Peter was Catholic the whole time, but his entire time at the Worker that we know of, did not shy away from friendships with communists or socialists or, you know, any other type of person or group, anyone who was interested in making the world a better place and one where it was easier for people to do good, they were interested in working with. And obviously when it comes to some of those people that they were working with, some of them would have very different views on marriage and relationships and sexuality. And you never read either of them saying, like, I won't work with this person because of their views on sex. So while, again, what their exact views are, I would probably imagine that they took a more conservative view of sexuality, but putting it in a different order of importance. And maybe I'll just share one last story with this. I believe it's in Dorothy's diaries that were published about 10 years ago or so, that she shares the journey of, she traveled with a group of women to one of the sessions of the Second Vatican Council during the mid-60s. And because this was a very common and way for a lot of people to travel, the boat that they were traveling on with her and with the group of women had many bishops on who were also traveling from the United States to Rome. And essentially, they were lobbying them. And once they got to the Vatican, they were going to continue this lobbying to condemn the use of nuclear weapons, to make sure that pacifism was legitimized now on an international level at this council. And in Dorothy's diaries, she complains about how when she's talking to some of these bishops, she's trying to talk to them about nuclear annihilation, the end of the world, and they are talking about birth control, which she supports, but it frustrates her that there's an issue that could end life on the planet as we know it. And they're talking about birth control, which in her frustration, though she never writes this anywhere or explicitly, but it's clear that birth control is lower on the list of her hierarchy of truths for what needs to be lived out and what's important and what's essential. So I do think that that story of Dorothy does help put, and I think even just looking at Peter and his work, while I do think he was against birth control and maybe had a more conservative view of sexuality, it wasn't his main message. And I think it, again, took on a role of lesser importance compared to what he viewed as the biggest problems we needed to face in the world together.
Well, and speaking of bishops, Dom Helder Camara took a stance opposed to Humanae Vitae when Humanae Vitae came out. And then just a few years later, he changed his mind and said that he thought it was a good thing. So, and he was a very prominent bishop at the time who very much like Dorothy and Peter, hung around socialists, and he called himself a socialist actually. Dorothy and Peter never did that. And they probably called themselves anarchists if they ever used terms like that, but they never did. So it's an interesting reality. And in fact, I don't know, maybe you know this story better than I do, but I remember there was a story of supposedly Dorothy, and I think it was Tamar, had a conversation, but it might have been somebody else, I don't remember. And somebody asked her during the Summer of Love why she wasn't out there with the hippies and promoting like free love and all of this other stuff. And she laughed and was like, "Because I did that way before all of them," in the 20s and the 30s and all that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember when I heard that story, I thought, that's hilarious. That sounds just like her.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard that story before, but it sounds like something that she could say. And like taking a birth control again as a for instance, I guess I'd have to ask somebody else. I've never researched this, but to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of any public Catholic figure during the 1930s or 1940s who would say birth control is okay. I mean, it was just the air that they breathed. If they were if they were in their 20s, 30s, or 40s right now, I have a feeling their views may be different on many of those issues. Because to the best of my knowledge, Dorothy, stayed an opponent of birth control until her death in 1980, when many other Catholics were disagreeing. But, I think that part of her Catholicism, and for sure for Peter Morin, who died so much earlier before Vatican II, For him, I don't think any Catholic seriously thought that they would disagree with the church's teaching on contraception. Just, there were no opposing views being sold, at least in the Catholic realm.
Yeah, so why don't we, we're going to have to wrap up. We're coming to the end of our time, but why don't you take the mic and kind of close out with, like, tell us a little bit about the end of his life and, how did he pass on? How old was he? What year? What was the worker like right after he died? How much of an impact that had? And any of your, final thoughts about Peter and the whole movement as we go forth, into continuing with what we're going through right now in the world.
I'm trying to think how old Peter would have been. I'm not doing the math right, but he died in 49. In one sense, this would almost have been a low point for the Catholic worker, at least from an outsider's perspective. When the Catholic worker started in the early 30s, it was very popular right from the start. There were no radical Catholic publications. And so, and there was a hunger for it. And there were even, many bishops disliked them, but they also had many bishops who supported them and wanted to make sure their paper was available in their diocese. So there was a groundswell initially. And even though their pacifism stance was probably always there from the start, I think it's the fact when World War II happened, I think it kind of shook many people who became former supporters, that they were actually pacifists, that Dorothy was a pacifist. And so you see the circulation just drop. You see the number of houses drop. I forget how many houses exactly, but let's say there were around like 40 Catholic worker houses going into World War II. And by the end of World War II, there were less than 10. And many of those, it was because the Catholic workers themselves, who were inspired by Dorothy and Peter, but then heard Dorothy's message of pacifism and just disagreed with her on it. They're like, we can buy into everything else you're talking about, but somehow felt that you could separate the rest of her radical message from pacifism. And so many of them, like here in Milwaukee, we were one of the World War II casualties, where almost everyone who was a part of the group here after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, almost all the men voluntarily joined the military. Some were then drafted, and essentially it was mainly a house for men at that time, and the few women who were left didn't feel comfortable running it, and so the house shut down. And so this is a very common phenomenon all over the place. And so there really is this now where they were embraced by so much of the Catholic, by American Catholicism in the 30s, they are now viewed with suspicion and shunned in the late 40s when Peter passes away. Peter wrote his last original easy essay in 1942, even though he lived another 7 years. We're not exactly sure why he stopped writing. Some people think that he was so distraught by France being invaded, but that had happened earlier. So the thing that seems maybe more likely is he started suffering from dementia. This really became clearer by the mid-40s, but maybe in one sense he had already started to notice it and just for whatever, and maybe because of that decided to stop writing. So there is, it's sometimes humorously told, but it's also a sad story of where Peter went missing for a few days in New York City, and no one knew where he was. And I don't remember how he got back, if police brought him back or, but he was gone for maybe 3 days and somehow was reunited. And after that, they made sure to always pin a note either inside his jacket pocket or inside his jacket that said, "I'm Peter Morin, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, and I live at," so that if something happened, he wouldn't just not be able to find his way home, which is what he said. He couldn't remember how to get back. And then the last couple of years, he kind of went in between staying at the New York house and staying up at the farm and staying with some friends. And then, 1949, kind of more in a, for the most part, peacefully passed away at the farm that the Catholic Worker had at that point. So, yeah, not too much fanfare, but but maybe that's the way Peter would have preferred it. He often was a forgotten figure, and that's another reason I wanted to write this book. I'll just share one last brief story, but Peter said there's a story of Peter being invited to speak at a Knights of Columbus group at a Catholic church in the 30s, and when we see him in the photo here, we can see like he's wearing a suit, and I guess I just think, oh, he's wearing a suit, fancy. But during the 1930s, everyone wore a suit, and I guess if you could see him in real life, you'd see that his suit didn't fit, it had stains on it, and so it wouldn't be uncommon that in this case he showed up at the Knights of Columbus meeting and they sent him away, and then the priest called the Catholic Worker and complained to Dorothy, "Why did you send me this bum?" Or in another instance where Peter was supposed to meet this professor at his home and have supper. He had been invited there, and he's maybe supposed to be there at 5. Now it's 6:30, and the professor, says to his wife, he's like, "Boy, where is he? He's so late." And then his wife says, "Well, right before you got home, someone showed up at the door, and I thought they were here to read the gas meter. I put him in the basement. Maybe he's still down there." And sure enough, he was in the basement. He was just sitting there for like over an hour and a half, just waiting. He thought that's where he was supposed to wait. So unfortunately, Peter has often been relegated to the basement in our American Catholic culture, and I'm hoping in some small way this can bring him back up to the living room.
That is such a great way to end. Well, thank you, Lincoln, for your contribution to our movement, and I enjoy having you as a friend and a brother in the struggle. We work together in war tax resistance, and I had such fun when I was in Chicago, and you came down to hang out with me that day, and we went and we wandered around, and it was like 2 Catholic workers wandering around the city, looking for mischief, and that was really a lot of fun, and so I really enjoy your friendship, and I enjoy the fact that you helped write you wrote this book rather, and I think it's important. Peter is a great human being, and a great model for what it means to be a disciple in our current world. So going forth, I hope that everybody will buy the book. I will put in the link of the description to this video at the bottom where you can buy the book. And also I'll put a link to the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee and the Catholic Worker website. And hopefully people are inspired by this conversation to do as Peter and Dorothy did, and go forth into the world and look at what the needs are of the world and do something about it, help to create, be cultural creatives. And so with that, remember that life is short and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who journey with us. So be swift to love, make haste to be kind, and may the blessing of the God of peace, the nonviolent Christ, and the liberating Spirit be with you always. And we will see you again next time.